When Prince George turned to his father with a question that no royal had dared utter aloud, "Can Charlotte be queen instead of me?" A wave of silent panic rippled through the palace. This wasn't just childhood curiosity. It was a challenge to centuries of tradition, a confession of fear, and perhaps a desire for freedom. And it left Prince William reeling. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It happened in a private drawing room at Windsor, just minutes before a scheduled appearance. George, only moments away from being ushered into the spotlight, turned with eyes clouded by something more than nerves. He asked the question not as a joke, not even in frustration, but with the earnest tone of a boy carrying the weight of 1,000 years of duty. William froze, his breath catching as though struck by a memory long buried. This wasn't the time for such a question, yet it was the only time George found the courage to ask it. William, though trained to conceal emotion, could not hide the flicker of heartbreak that passed across his face. He saw in George a reflection of his own childhood, a boy burdened not by choice, but by bloodline. The room was silent for a beat too long. And in that stillness, something began to unravel. For years, the public saw George as the smiling heir, the picture of royal confidence. But behind the palace walls, a different reality had been growing. One filled with quiet observation, subtle anxiety, and a bond with his sister deeper than anyone had understood. George had watched Charlotte not just as a sister, but as a leader in her own right. She moved with a natural command of attention, a sense of balance and empathy rare for her age. While George was thrust into role after role, Charlotte seemed to thrive, effortlessly navigating the pressure, even when she wasn't expected to. It wasn't envy George felt, it was admiration, and perhaps a yearning to step aside for someone he believed could do the job better. William's mind raced. He thought of duty, of legacy, of what the crown demanded. But beneath that, he felt the stab of guilt. Had he, in trying to raise a future king, forgotten to raise a son? Had he placed tradition above well-being, as had been done to him? The timing of the question couldn't have been worse, and yet, it couldn't have been more revealing. George was asking for more than permission to leave the path. He was seeking a voice, a say in his own fate. The symbolism of the moment ran deeper than anyone dared say aloud. It wasn't just a boy questioning the throne. It was the first true crack in a lineage that had for centuries remained unbending. A cry not just from George, but perhaps from the next generation of royals who no longer saw the crown as a blessing, but as a burden. But this wasn't just about George, it was about a dynasty at a crossroads, and a sister whose presence has quietly reshaped the monarchy. With her grace, confidence, and uncanny poise, Princess Charlotte has captivated the public in ways no one expected. Behind closed doors, some royal aides have begun whispering a controversial phrase: "She was born to lead." But what happens when the future queen the people want isn't the one destiny has chosen? From the moment she stepped onto the royal stage, Charlotte defied every assumption. What began as innocent charm in childhood swiftly evolved into something far more commanding, an intuitive sense of diplomacy, a steeliness beneath her smile. She stood beside her brothers with a quiet yet unmistakable authority, one that seemed to surpass her years and rank. Cameras caught the moments, the gestures, the composure, and the public responded with fervor. Tabloids crowned her the future of the monarchy. Social media dubbed her queen in waiting, and all the while, within palace walls, the atmosphere began to shift. The question no one dared speak aloud was now hanging in the air. Was the line of succession about to meet its match in public opinion? Senior courtiers and advisors, hardened by decades of palace politics, found themselves reluctantly admitting what they saw. Charlotte had something different. Not just charm, but control. Not just etiquette, but instinct. She reminded them of a young Elizabeth II, yet carried the emotional connectivity of Princess Diana. It was a potent mix, one the monarchy hadn't seen in decades. Whispers grew louder. "She walks like a queen," one aide noted. "George may wear the title, but Charlotte wears the crown." These weren't just idle observations, they were warnings. Because admiration, in the royal world, often foreshadows tension. Within the family, the dynamic shifted in subtle but powerful ways. At events, Charlotte naturally took the lead when George hesitated. During formal gatherings, It was her who subtly corrected protocols with a grace that didn't embarrass but elevated. Even senior royals noticed. Catherine, once the central calming force, now watched as her daughter began to emerge as the silent fulcrum of the younger generation. William, too, was not immune to the comparison. He saw it in how Charlotte carried herself. He saw it in how others looked at her. But this meteoric rise came at a price, and its weight was heaviest on the shoulders of her brother. For George, it wasn't jealousy. It was something more corrosive. Doubt. Doubt that perhaps the future had been misassigned. Doubt that maybe he wasn't the monarch his country wanted, or worse, needed. And as the voices praising Charlotte grew louder, so too did the silence that began to surround George. Every comment, every headline, every comparison chipped away at his confidence. No one spoke of the toll. But it was there. In the quiet distance between siblings. In the sleepless nights that Catherine could sense but couldn't fix. In William's unspoken fear that history was repeating itself, this time between his own children. Still, Charlotte never asked for the crown. Her leadership was not performed, it was lived. But in a world where image can become destiny, her very existence became a disruption to the natural order, and the monarchy, once steadfast in its path, was now staring into a storm of public pressure, private pain, and a future that no longer seemed set in stone. Yet even the most beloved princess cannot rewrite the rules of succession, unless those very rules are already cracking from within. Behind his polished smile, William, Prince of Wales, carries a father's torment haunted by the weight of his own upbringing, and now facing his son's quiet rebellion. As George asks to relinquish his destiny, William must confront a brutal truth. Is he repeating the cycle that nearly destroyed him? For years, William has walked a delicate line between royal responsibility and emotional survival. He remembers the cold, rigid expectations of his own childhood, the public appearances masked in grief, the relentless gaze of duty even as his heart broke behind closed doors. He remembers being told how to feel, when to smile, and what his future would be before he was old enough to question it. Those memories never left him, and now, as George gazes up at him with wide, searching eyes, William feels the past clawing its way forward. History, it seems, is knocking again, and this time it has his son's face. William's instinct is to protect. Always. But protection inside the monarchy is not a simple thing. He wants George to be free, but the reality of the crown demands sacrifice. And when George asked if Charlotte could be queen in his place, William felt the sharp split of two worlds colliding, one where his son could be happy, and one where the monarchy could survive. That night, behind palace doors, William and Catherine spoke in hushed tones, the weight of their son's question heavy between them. Catherine, ever the anchor, reminded him of the promise they made, to raise their children differently. But how do you raise a child for freedom inside a system built on obligation? He confided in her, for the first time, the guilt that had been growing silently. Guilt that George had inherited a title he didn't choose. Guilt that despite all their efforts to modernize the monarchy, they were still repeating the same story. And guilt that he, once the child silently crying for space, was now the father trying to hold his own son together. But Catherine saw something else. She saw in George the same sensitivity that once made William strong, and in Charlotte, a strength shaped not by expectation, but by instinct. The problem wasn't the children, it was the system around them. Caught in this storm, William turned to the only person who understood what it meant to live with the burden of the crown, his father. The meeting with Charles III was private, tense, and unrecorded. William spoke plainly. He told his father of George's question, of the weight he was carrying, of the emotional cost. Charles listened in silence, but his eyes, those aged and weary eyes, said more than words. When he finally spoke, it wasn't in royal decree, but in personal reflection. "You know how it feels," Charles murmured. "You always have." There was no resolution, only understanding. And yet, in that moment, a seed of change was planted. William left the room knowing one thing for certain. If the cycle was to be broken, it had to begin now. Not with policy, not with protocol, but with courage. And George's plea wasn't weakness. It was clarity. The future could no longer be assumed, it had to be chosen. But George's emotional plea was only the beginning. Beneath it lay secrets stretching across generations, and a forbidden clause buried deep within royal history. Hidden for decades, a nearly forgotten clause in a long-sealed royal document has re-emerged, one that may provide an astonishing path for Princess Charlotte to ascend the throne legally. But exposing it could ignite a constitutional crisis and tear the royal family apart. The discovery came not through official channels, but through a whisper, a passing remark, from a former palace archivist whose conscience had grown heavier with time. Buried within a collection of documents dating back to George VI's private correspondence was a clause unlike any other. It proposed a radical departure from centuries of tradition, a merit-based framework for succession, one that could, under extraordinary circumstances, bypass the firstborn in favor of the most capable heir. Though it was never enacted into law, it had been drafted, debated, and quietly locked away. It was a contingency never meant to see daylight. Until now. The implications were seismic. If this clause were proven valid, it could change everything. Legal scholars pounced on the story, each with competing interpretations. Some claimed it was legally worthless without parliamentary ratification, while others pointed to precedents that suggested royal prerogative might allow it to be revived. The media frenzy intensified, but inside the palace, fear was growing. Because this wasn't just a legal question, it was personal. Deeply personal. And not everyone was shocked by the clause's existence. In hushed tones, Catherine admitted to William that Princess Anne had once warned her of such a document, years ago after Charlotte's birth. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than folklore. But now, with George's crisis unfolding and public sentiment veering toward Charlotte, the forgotten clause had become a weapon or a lifeline. But darker whispers swirled around its history. Rumors that the Queen Mother, once aware of the clause's potential to fracture the monarchy, had actively tried to suppress it. Some even suggested she ordered the destruction of related papers. But one key piece had survived just enough to raise questions, just enough to trigger alarm. And now, under mounting pressure, William and Catherine found themselves racing against time to understand the truth. If the clause held weight, what did it mean for George, for Charlotte, and what would it cost them all? Their pursuit led them to Balmoral, where an obscure entry in a staff inventory suggested the existence of a locked vault hidden within the estate. Inside, it was said, lay the personal journal of a royal advisor, one whose writings may confirm the clause's intent. But when aides attempted to locate it, the journal was missing, gone without a trace. Whether removed deliberately or lost through time, its absence only deepened the mystery. Now, more than ever, William and Catherine were navigating blind, caught between protecting their children and preserving the institution that defined their very lives. As tensions mounted and speculation exploded, the monarchy stood on a knife's edge. What had begun as a child's question had now spiraled into a battle of precedent, power, and survival. And as legal and royal tensions collide, another player steps from the shadows, someone who has everything to lose if Charlotte's rise becomes real. Queen Camilla has fought tooth and nail for legitimacy, and now, as whispers of a new female monarch threaten the order she helped cement, she begins her own campaign behind palace walls. What begins as quiet resistance soon spirals into something far more dangerous. For decades, Camilla had clawed her way through layers of scandal, scrutiny, and royal resistance to stand where she stands now. Queen consort. Official. Accepted. But never fully embraced. Her place beside Charles III had always felt like a fragile crown, one worn with caution, balanced on shifting public opinion. And now, with Charlotte rising in the hearts of the people and the corridors of the palace, Camilla saw it all unraveling. This wasn't just about a little girl favored by the press. It was about power, real, generational, lasting power being redirected before her very eyes. And she wasn't going to let that happen. Camilla's fears were not without basis. Charles III's reign was already walking on brittle ice. Age, health concerns, and lukewarm public affection made every move precarious. To her, the idea of a sudden shift in the line of succession, even theoretical, was nothing short of madness. It would shatter the delicate image of stability they had spent years constructing. And so, she moved not with fanfare, but with calculation. A quiet word to a trusted courtier here. a subtle reminder to Charles of what the country needs there. She began to shape the conversations in rooms where decisions were born, slowly bending the narrative away from change and back toward tradition. But tradition came at a cost, and that cost wore the face of Prince George. Camilla had always been wary of Charlotte's growing spotlight, but now she saw her as a direct threat. It wasn't long before discreet calls were made to favored members of the press. Nothing overt, just a few planted stories about George's struggles, his shyness, his lack of readiness. Enough to raise questions, enough to stir doubt, all under the guise of concern. Yet the message was clear: George might falter, but replacing him would destroy the crown. Inside the palace, tensions began to rise. Catherine, who had once offered grace even in the face of slights, started to see Camilla's moves for what they were. There were no open accusations, but the air between them thickened with unspoken truth. A private conversation between the two ended in silence so heavy it echoed through the staff for days. But the real eruption came between Camilla and William. What began as a discussion over press coverage escalated into a rare and raw confrontation. William, driven by the instinct to defend his son, no longer tempered his tone. He accused Camilla of manipulation, of exploiting George's vulnerability, of playing politics with a child's future. And in that moment, the palace split into something more than factions. It became a battlefield of ideologies. Camilla stood her ground, but even she knew the tides were shifting. The rules were no longer fixed. The narrative was slipping from her grasp, and no amount of tradition could hold back the coming storm. Because while Camilla seeks to preserve tradition, it is Princess Catherine who holds the emotional center of this unraveling storm, and she is no longer staying silent. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has always played her role with flawless elegance, but now, she is caught in an unbearable dilemma. Should she push her son down the path he dreads, or champion her daughter into the throne's cruel spotlight? For years, Catherine had mastered the art of composure. She had stood beside William through scandal, scrutiny, and seismic shifts in public expectation, earning her place not by force, but by quiet resilience. But this was different. This was no longer about palace politics or royal appearances. This was about her children. And the choice that now weighed on her heart was one she was never meant to make. In the soft stillness of Kensington's private quarters, she'd begun having intimate conversations with Charlotte. Conversations that echoed with a strange mix of maternal pride and silent terror. Charlotte, ever perceptive, had asked questions. Questions that reminded Catherine just how much of the crown had already seeped into her daughter's world. And in Charlotte's voice, she heard a confidence that thrilled her and terrified her in equal measure. Catherine was a mother first, but royalty was a role that never loosened its grip. She saw George's struggle, the pressure behind his polite smile, the weight of duty settling onto shoulders not yet grown. And then there was Charlotte, blooming beneath that same weight as if born to command it. Was it right to redirect the line of succession? To spare her son the pain he feared, even if it meant exposing her daughter to that very same fate? The conflict tore at her in ways she could never admit aloud. But her private writings told a different story. In diary pages she never intended anyone to read, she laid bare a hope that someday the monarchy could evolve not just in who ruled, but in why and how. She dreamed of a future where service wasn't punishment, and duty didn't demand the silencing of the soul. But that dream was beginning to fray at the edges. Her growing distrust of Queen Camilla had become impossible to hide. Catherine had long tried to keep the peace, to remain neutral for the sake of the family. But recent events, the leaks, the whispers, the quiet attacks on George's readiness had made neutrality impossible. She could see the pattern clearly now. Camilla wasn't just resisting change, she was sabotaging it. And as a mother, Catherine would not remain still while someone weaponized her son's vulnerability for the sake of palace politics. But the deeper fear ran within. Because Charlotte, sharp, composed, and increasingly aware, was beginning to believe she could step up. And Catherine feared that belief, not because it was wrong, but because it might just be right. The moment it all broke came quietly. No press. No witnesses. Just Catherine and her sister Pippa, late one evening, alone in the royal residence. The weight of it all collapsed onto her chest: George's anxiety, Charlotte's rise, William's struggle, Camilla's games, the future of the crown, and she wept. Not for herself, but for the impossible burden her children were about to inherit. Pippa, stunned, said nothing. She simply held her. Because even princesses are mothers. And even mothers sometimes break. Yet as the family fragments under the weight of this generational standoff, one voice long silent is about to shatter everything. Charles III, weakened but not defeated, calls for a private meeting with William and George. What unfolds behind those locked palace doors is a stunning royal reckoning, one that will test father, son, and king. And when the doors open, everything has changed. The summons came without warning, delivered with no explanation, no entourage, and no press in sight. Charles, visibly frailer, had been silent amid the rising storm, allowing speculation to ferment. But now, the king had something to say, and he would speak only to his heir and grandson. Inside the room, the weight of lineage settled like dust. William's jaw was tight, his mind still clouded with Catherine's tears and George's question echoing through his thoughts. George, quiet but watchful, looked at his grandfather not as a monarch, but as a man who had once carried the same burden he now feared. Then, for the first time in years, Charles spoke without the armor of the crown. What followed was not command but confession. He spoke of Diana, not as the people's princess, but as the ghost that haunted every decision he'd ever made as a father. He admitted his regrets, the times he was absent, the moments he buried emotion for the sake of image. And then, turning his gaze to George, his voice cracked with something raw. "You remind me of William at your age. But your eyes carry something else." A question I never dared ask myself. The room fell still. It was not power Charles wielded now, it was vulnerability. And in that moment the generations collided. The past, the present, and the heir to both. George asked his grandfather the same question he had asked his father. Does the crown choose me, or do I have a choice? Charles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he rose slowly, walked to the window, and after a long pause, delivered a sentence that would echo through royal history. The crown chooses who is strong enough to bear it, not who wants it, not who deserves it, but who can carry its weight without losing their soul. It wasn't an answer. It was a warning, a prophecy, a challenge. Then came the revelation that shook both father and son. Charles would convene the Privy Council not to change the succession, but to assess the clause that had resurfaced, to weigh its legal merit and public consequence. It was an unprecedented move. And with it came fear. If the council leaned toward merit-based succession, it would upend centuries of tradition and ignite political turmoil. Parliament was already bracing for impact. Behind the scenes, constitutional advisors scrambled. The balance of power was tilting and the king had just moved his piece. When the meeting ended, William exited the room with the look of a man torn in two, his father's confession in one hand, his son's future in the other. George followed moments later, his face wet with silent tears, yet his steps held a different weight. Not fear, not doubt, but the first flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Understanding. The burden was still his for now, but the path ahead was no longer paved in stone. It was being rewritten, one choice at a time. But even as decisions are made, fate has its own plans, and the final twist will come not from within the palace, but from a nation watching closely. In a digital age where monarchy meets modernity, millions have done the unthinkable, signed a petition calling for Princess Charlotte to be crowned queen. With headlines exploding and public sentiment shifting, Buckingham Palace is forced into a reckoning it never saw coming. It began with a video. Just a few seconds of Princess Charlotte, poised and articulate, addressing a children's hospital during a private charity engagement. There was no royal press coverage, no official statement, just a single clip posted online by a nurse who happened to be in the room. But in those few seconds, the world saw something extraordinary. A girl not just mimicking leadership, but embodying it. The clip spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media erupted. Within days, something far bigger was born. A movement, a question, a demand. #Queen Charlotte Now trended globally within 48 hours. On TikTok, videos praising her composure reached tens of millions of views. Young people, many previously indifferent to the monarchy, suddenly felt inspired by a vision that looked new, bold, and refreshingly female. Online forums transformed into echo chambers of what-if speculation. What if Charlotte led the monarchy into the next era? What if this was the moment to shatter tradition and start anew? The question wasn't whether Charlotte could lead, it was why she hadn't been chosen to. And then came the petition. A digital referendum not sanctioned by law, but powered by emotion. It swept across platforms, gaining momentum with staggering speed. At first, palace insiders dismissed it as noise and emotional reaction to the recent royal turmoil. But as it crossed the 1 million mark, then 3, then 5, it could no longer be ignored. Parliamentarians were caught off guard. Advisors were blindsided. Buckingham Palace, the symbol of unshakable tradition, suddenly looked shaken. The press scrambled to contain the narrative, but it was too late. Front pages declared a royal reckoning. Pundits questioned whether the monarchy could afford to ignore such a clear surge in public sentiment. Others warned of the dangers of setting precedent by popularity. Inside royal offices, panic quietly brewed. No one could recall the last time the institution had been so thoroughly outpaced by its own people. The monarchy wasn't just under scrutiny, it was being reimagined in real time. All eyes turned to William and Catherine, the only two figures who could calm the tide or fan its flames. Days passed in silence. Then finally, a joint statement was released, brief, somber, and hauntingly cryptic. We hear the voices. We carry the weight of tradition, but also the future. Our children will grow into the roles they were born into, and the ones they choose. The message offered no clear answers. Yet beneath its ambiguity, a new narrative began to crystallize. One where duty and desire no longer stood in opposition, but in conversation. Charlotte, for her part, remained silent. But silence in this new era spoke volumes. The world had spoken, and the palace had no choice but to listen. What began as whispers of succession had become the roar of revolution. But just when the future seemed poised to break from tradition, a final twist changes the course of royal history once again. As the media storm rages, Prince George retreats from public view. Days later, a handwritten letter is leaked to the press, authored by George himself. What it contains isn't surrender, but something far more shocking: love, leadership, and a legacy reimagined. In the wake of public uproar and private turmoil, the young prince disappeared from the spotlight. No appearances, no statements, no photographs. Rumors swirled. Some said he was overwhelmed. Others claimed he was being shielded. But what none expected was that George wasn't retreating in fear, he was writing. In silence and solitude, he penned a letter that would not only shake the royal household, but touch a nerve across the entire nation. When the letter found its way to the press, through channels still cloaked in mystery, its title alone stunned the world: "To my sister, my queen." It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a breakdown. It was clarity, raw, brave, and heartbreakingly noble. The words inside were simple, but devastating in their truth. George spoke of pressure, of expectation that never felt earned but imposed, of the days he felt invisible under a title that was never truly his, of watching Charlotte shine not just as a sister, but as someone destined to lead with grace, instinct, and empathy. "I do not step aside out of fear," he wrote, "but out of love. Love for her, love for this country, love for the truth we both already know." It was not a resignation. It was a revolution delivered with the quiet power only a boy forced to grow up too fast could wield. Within the palace, the letter landed like a thunderclap. William read it in silence, hands trembling. Catherine wept not out of sadness, but out of pride. Charlotte, the intended recipient, broke down behind closed doors, unsure whether to feel honored or heartbroken. Even Charles, whose stoicism rarely cracked, sat alone for hours with the letter resting beside a framed photograph of Diana. In the days that followed, something began to shift. Not loudly, not publicly, but undeniably. The royal machinery, long resistant to change, began to creak open. At Trooping the Colour, the traditional celebration of the sovereign, Charles did something no one had anticipated. As the royal family stood assembled, he asked George to remain by his side, still visible. still honored but subtly behind Charlotte. It was a gesture few noticed at first, but those who understood, those who followed the letter, saw it for what it was. A quiet acknowledgement of a new reality. Not a dethroning, but a redirection. A symbol that choice, finally, had been allowed into the blood-bound rituals of monarchy. Behind the scenes, discussions intensified. Advisors spoke cautiously of modern adaptation. Plans were drafted for future contingency reforms, nothing official, nothing immediate. But everything was different now. Because George had not just asked to be heard. He had been heard. And for the first time in generations, a member of the royal family had rewritten their own fate, not with rebellion, but with love. As the crown redefines itself in a new age, one truth becomes clear. Sometimes the most powerful act of royalty is letting go. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.